You know how we picture Tudor princesses. The gorgeous red hair, the pearls dripping from elaborate gowns, the grand palaces with roaring fires and feasts that went on for days. Maybe there's a handsome courtier involved. Maybe a dramatic coronation. It's all very romantic and very much not what actually happened. The real story involves beheadings, imprisonment, poison scares, and one little girl who spent years wondering if her father was going to kill her the way he'd killed her mother. Because real Tudor princesses weren't just posing for portraits. They were surviving, watching, learning exactly who in the room wanted them dead. And sometimes, if they were very, very clever, blasting everyone who'd tried to destroy them. Tonight, we're going to follow two of them. Sisters, sort of. Both daughters of the same terrifying king. Both growing up in the shadow of the axe. One of them would burn hundreds of people alive. The other would become the most famous queen in English history. And they started out as frightened little girls in cold stone rooms, just trying to figure out the rules of a game that could kill them at any moment. Get comfortable. This one's going to take a while. So imagine this. You're lying in bed in a Tudor palace, and the first thing you notice is that it's not as warm as you'd expect. Yes, you've got tapestries on the walls. Yes, there's a fire crackling somewhere nearby. But these palaces were drafty beyond belief. We're talking about buildings designed more for impressing visitors than for keeping people comfortable. High ceilings meant the heat rose up and away from you. Stone floors sucked the warmth right out of the air. The windows were bigger than medieval ones. Glass was finally affordable for royalty. But bigger windows meant more cold seeping in through every crack and gap. Your bed is elaborate. Carved wooden posts reaching toward the ceiling. Heavy curtains pulled tight around you to trap your body heat. The mattress beneath you is stuffed with goose down if you're lucky, wool if you're not. There are furs piled on top. Maybe a brass warming pan that some servant filled with hot coals and slid under the covers an hour ago. It's cooled down by now, obviously. Everything cools down eventually. You're maybe 6 years old, or 7, or 8. It doesn't matter, because your life has already been defined by things you don't understand. Your father is King Henry VIII. Let that sink in for a moment. Your father is the man who will eventually marry 6 women and behead 2 of them. Your father is the man who will break away from the Catholic Church, dissolve the monasteries, execute his closest friends and advisors when they displease him. Your father weighs over 300 pounds and has a leg wound that never heals and smells of rotting flesh. And he loves you. Probably. For now, here's what nobody tells you about being Henry VII's daughter. Everything depends on things completely outside your control. Are you a boy? No. Then you're already a disappointment. Is your mother in favor? Is she pregnant again? Is there hope she might still produce that precious male heir? Then you might be treated well. You might be called princess. You might be dressed in cloth of gold and paraded before ambassadors. But if your mother falls out of favor, if she fails to give your father a son, if he finds someone younger and prettier, if the political winds shift, then you fall with her. That's the thing about being a Tudor princess. You weren't really a person. You were an extension of your mother's status. When she rose, you rose. When she fell, you fell. And in Henry's court, people fell very, very hard. Let me tell you about Mary first. Mary Tudor was born in 1516, the only surviving child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was Spanish royalty, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the ones who funded Columbus and expelled the Jews and united Spain under Catholic rule. She had been married to Henry's older brother Arthur first, but Arthur died within months of the wedding, and Catherine swore the marriage had never been consummated, and eventually she married Henry instead. They were happy for a while, or at least Henry was happy enough. Catherine was intelligent, well-educated, devout. She could run the kingdom while Henry went off to fight wars in France. When the Scots invaded England and Henry was across the Channel, Catherine organized the defense, and the English army defeated the Scots so thoroughly that the Scottish king himself was killed on the battlefield. Catherine sent Henry a piece of the dead Scottish king's coat as a trophy. That's the kind of woman Catherine of Aragon was. Fierce, capable, absolutely certain of her own righteousness. She was also incapable of giving Henry a living son. She got pregnant 6 times, maybe more. The records are unclear. She had miscarriages. She had stillbirths. She had babies who lived for a few hours or a few days or a few weeks and then died. One son, named Henry, lived for almost 2 months before dying in 1511. Catherine was devastated. Henry was devastated. And then came Mary, healthy, strong. a princess instead of a prince, but alive, which was more than could be said for all the others. Henry doted on her, at least initially. He called her the greatest pearl in the kingdom. He showed her off to ambassadors. He had her educated the way a prince would be educated: Latin, Greek, philosophy, music, theology. Mary was smart, quick. She could play the virginals beautifully by the time she was 4. She could read and write in multiple languages before she was 10. She was also, for a while, heir to the throne of England. Then Anne Boleyn happened. Anne Boleyn. Just the name still carries weight 500 years later. The woman who changed everything. The woman who helped start the English Reformation. The woman who gave birth to Elizabeth. The woman who got her head cut off when Elizabeth was 2 years old. Here's what you need to understand about Anne. She was not a passive participant in her own rise. She wasn't some innocent girl swept up in a king's desires. Anne was ambitious, intelligent, politically savvy. She had spent years at the French court learning how to navigate power. She had watched her sister Mary become Henry's mistress and then get discarded when he was done with her. Anne wasn't going to make that mistake. When Henry started pursuing her, Anne said no. She would not be his mistress. She would be his wife or nothing. For 7 years, Henry pursued her. 7 years of courtship. 7 years of increasingly desperate attempts to annul his marriage to Catherine. 7 years that would eventually lead to England breaking away from the Catholic Church entirely, just so Henry could marry the woman who kept saying no. Think about that. The entire religious and political landscape of England changed because Anne Boleyn understood her own value. Catherine fought. She refused to accept the annulment. She refused to acknowledge that her marriage had been invalid. She refused to go quietly into the night. The Pope refused to grant the annulment. So Henry decided he didn't need the Pope anymore. In 1533, Henry married Anne in secret. She was already pregnant. By September, she gave birth to a daughter. Not a son, a daughter. They named her Elizabeth. Mary was 17 when Elizabeth was born. 17 years old, and suddenly her entire world collapsed. Her father declared that his marriage to her mother had never been valid. That meant Mary wasn't legitimate. That meant she wasn't a princess anymore. She was just Lady Mary, a bastard, no longer in line for the throne. Everything was taken from her. her household, her servants, her status. She was sent to live in her baby sister's household, not as a guest, but as a servant. The princess, who had once been heir to England, was now expected to wait upon the infant who had replaced her. Mary refused to acknowledge Elizabeth as princess. She refused to use the title. She called Elizabeth the king's daughter at best, sometimes just it. When asked to curtsy to the baby, Mary reportedly said she knew of no princess in England except herself. This was dangerous. Anne Boleyn was queen now, and Anne did not like threats to her daughter's position. There were rumors that Anne wanted Mary dead, that she was looking for ways to have the stubborn teenager executed, or at least permanently removed from the picture. Mary started getting sick. Mysterious illnesses, headaches, stomach pains. Was she being poisoned? She didn't know. Her father refused to see her. Her mother was locked away in a succession of increasingly grim castles, forbidden from contacting her daughter. Mary was alone in a court that wanted her gone. She survived anyway. The thing about surviving the Tudor court was that you had to understand when to bend. Mary's mother never bent. Catherine went to her grave insisting she was the true Queen of England, that her marriage was valid, that her daughter was legitimate. She died in January 1536, possibly of cancer, possibly of something else entirely. After her death, her doctor found that her heart was completely black. Nobody knew what that meant. People whispered about poison. Mary wasn't at her mother's deathbed. She hadn't seen Catherine in years. Henry had forbidden it, and Catherine had accepted the prohibition because she understood the politics. If she and Mary were together, they became a rallying point for Catherine's supporters. Apart, they were less dangerous. Catherine wrote Mary one final letter. She told her daughter to obey the king in everything, as long as it didn't compromise her soul. She told her to be patient. She told her to take comfort in God. And then she died, and Mary was truly alone. But here's where things get strange. Because just 4 months after Catherine died, Anne Boleyn was arrested. Anne's fall was shockingly fast. One day she was Queen of England, presiding over the May Day jousts, watching the knights compete for her favor. The next day, she was in the Tower of London, charged with adultery, incest, and treason. The charges were almost certainly false. Anne was accused of sleeping with 5 men including her own brother. The evidence was flimsy. The confessions were obtained under torture. The whole thing had the feel of something manufactured, something designed to give Henry an excuse to do what he already wanted to do, because Anne had failed too. She had given Henry Elizabeth, yes, but then came a miscarriage, then another. She had lost a male child in January 1536. Some said she had been terrified by news that Henry had been injured in a jousting accident, and the shock had caused the miscarriage. Henry was done with her. The trial was a formality. Anne was found guilty. She was sentenced to death by beheading, a mercy compared to the burning that was the standard punishment for treason by a woman. Henry had sent to France for a skilled swordsman rather than using the regular axe. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked out onto the scaffold. She was 35 years old, maybe younger. She was wearing a gray damask gown trimmed with fur. Her famous dark hair was pinned up under a cap. The swordsman hid his blade in the straw. He called out to distract her, "Bring me the sword." And while Anne's head turned to look, he swung. It was over in a single stroke. Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old. She would never remember her mother, but she would spend the rest of her life knowing exactly how her mother had died. Now here's where it gets complicated, because after Anne's death, you might expect Mary's situation to improve. Her great enemy was gone. The woman who had replaced her mother was dead. Surely now her father would welcome her back. Not quite. Henry was already engaged to Jane Seymour. He had proposed to her the day after Anne's execution. He wanted a fresh start. He wanted a son. And he wanted both Mary and Elizabeth to acknowledge that they were illegitimate, that neither of them had any claim to the throne. Mary was pressured, threatened, told that if she didn't sign a document accepting her own illegitimacy, terrible things would happen. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, made it clear that her life might be at stake. Mary held out as long as she could, but in the end, she bent. She signed. She called herself illegitimate. She acknowledged that her mother's marriage had been invalid. She submitted completely to her father's will. It broke something in her. You can see it in the letters she wrote afterward, the desperate attempts to convince herself and others that she had done the right thing, the only possible thing. She never quite forgave herself for that moment of weakness, but she survived. Jane Seymour gave Henry his son. Edward was born in October 1537, a healthy baby boy, the heir Henry had been waiting for through 28 years and 3 wives. Jane died 12 days later from complications of childbirth, but Henry had what he wanted. Mary was 21 years old when her baby half-brother was born. Elizabeth was 4. Both of them had been declared illegitimate, but both of them were still in the line of succession. Parliament had arranged it so that if Edward died without heirs, Mary would inherit, and if Mary died without heirs, Elizabeth would inherit, which meant both of them were still potentially valuable. And being valuable, as we've established, was a dangerous thing. The years that followed were a strange mix of rehabilitation and continued precariousness. Henry married 3 more times. Anne of Cleves, whom he found so unattractive that he couldn't consummate the marriage, and divorced her after 6 months. Catherine Howard, who was young and pretty, and almost certainly did commit adultery, and who followed Anne Boleyn to the scaffold in 1542. Catherine Parr, who was intelligent and kind, and actually managed to survive Henry, though there was one terrifying moment when she nearly didn't. Mary and Elizabeth lived through all of it. They watched their father's wives come and go. They learned to read the political winds. They learned when to be visible and when to disappear. They learned that the wrong word at the wrong moment could mean death. Elizabeth was particularly good at this. She had to be. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the infamous witch whore, the woman who had displaced the rightful queen and then betrayed the king. Every time Elizabeth appeared at court, she was a reminder of that scandal. Every time she opened her mouth, people were watching to see if she had inherited her mother's dangerous ambition. So Elizabeth learned to be careful. She learned to say nothing that could be used against her. She learned to be agreeable, obedient, the perfect model of a dutiful daughter. She learned to survive. Henry VIII died in January 1547. He was 55 years old, massively overweight, his leg wound finally spreading infection that his body couldn't fight off anymore. Edward, just 9 years old, became king. What followed was a regency council, Protestant reforms, and an increasingly uncomfortable situation for Mary, who had remained devoutly Catholic despite everything. Edward's government pressured her to conform to the new Protestant religion. She refused. She kept practicing Catholicism in private, celebrating Mass with her household, defying the new laws. Elizabeth was more careful. She conformed. She attended Protestant services. She said all the right things. Whether she actually believed any of it is still debated by historians. Elizabeth was too smart to leave evidence of her true feelings. The siblings had an uneasy relationship. Edward seemed to genuinely care for Elizabeth. He was less sure about Mary, whom he considered dangerously Catholic and possibly treasonous. There were moments when it looked like he might move against her, might strip her of her succession rights, might even have her arrested. And then Edward got sick. The king was dying. He was 15 years old, and he was dying of what was probably tuberculosis. Though the historical records describe all sorts of horrible symptoms, coughing blood, swelling limbs, hair falling out, fever that wouldn't break, Edward knew he was dying. And he was desperate to keep the Catholic Mary from inheriting the throne and undoing all the Protestant reforms he believed in. So he wrote a new will. He skipped over both of his sisters. Both of them were technically illegitimate, after all, and left the crown to Lady Jane Grey. Jane Grey was a teenage girl, a cousin of the Tudors, and a committed Protestant. She was also, by all accounts, completely horrified by the idea of becoming queen. When they told her Edward had chosen her as his heir, she allegedly fainted. When she was brought to the Tower of London to prepare for her coronation, she was trembling. The crown was placed on her head. She was Queen of England. For 9 days, Mary wasn't going to accept this. The moment she heard about Edward's death, she fled into the countryside and started gathering supporters. And here's the remarkable thing. They came. Ordinary people, nobles, soldiers. They flocked to Mary's banner because, whatever the law said, she was Henry VIII's daughter. She was the rightful heir. Jane Grey was a usurper being manipulated by ambitious men. Mary raised an army. She marched on London. The Privy Council, which had initially backed Jane, realized they had miscalculated. They switched sides. Jane's own father-in-law, the Duke of Northumberland, was arrested. Mary entered London in triumph. The people cheered. They rang the church bells. They lit bonfires in the streets. After all the chaos of the previous decades, after all the religious turmoil and political uncertainty, the rightful queen was finally taking her throne. Jane Grey was sent to the Tower. She was 16 years old. Mary didn't want to execute Jane. That's important to understand. Jane was young, clearly a pawn in her father-in-law's schemes, possibly an innocent victim. Mary was inclined to mercy. She kept Jane in the Tower, but she didn't sign a death warrant. Then there was a rebellion. Thomas Wyatt led an uprising in early 1554, protesting Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain. The rebels marched on London. For a terrifying few hours, it looked like Mary's reign might collapse before it had really begun. Mary stood firm. She gave a speech at the Guildhall that convinced Londoners to stay loyal. The rebellion was crushed, but now Mary couldn't afford to leave threats alive. Jane Grey was too dangerous. She was a potential figurehead for future Protestant rebellions. As long as Jane lived, people could rally around her. The death warrant was signed. Jane was 17. On the morning of her execution, she watched from her window as her husband was led to his death on the public scaffold. She saw his body brought back in a cart, wrapped in bloody cloth. Then it was her turn. She walked out onto the private scaffold inside the Tower. She gave a short speech, acknowledging that she had accepted the crown even though she shouldn't have. She asked the executioner if he would take her head off before she lay down, but he said no. She tied a blindfold over her own eyes. Then she couldn't find the block. Picture this: a blindfolded 17-year-old girl kneeling on a scaffold, reaching out her hands and saying, "What shall I do? Where is it?" Someone guided her to the block. She laid her head down. She said her final words, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The axe fell, and Elizabeth was in terrible danger. Wyatt's rebellion had been partly in her name. The rebels had wanted to depose Mary and put Elizabeth on the throne instead. Elizabeth swore she had nothing to do with it. She wrote to Mary, pleading her innocence. Mary didn't believe her. Elizabeth was arrested and brought to the Tower. She entered through Traitor's Gate, the same water entrance that prisoners had been using for generations. It was raining. Elizabeth sat down on the wet steps and refused to move, knowing that entering the Tower might mean never coming out. Eventually, she was forced inside. For 2 months, Elizabeth was a prisoner in the Tower of London, in the same building where her mother had been held before her execution. She didn't know if she was going to live or die. Every footstep in the corridor could be someone coming to take her to the scaffold. She wrote letters. She insisted on her innocence. She was interrogated repeatedly. She gave nothing away, no evidence, no admissions, nothing that could be used against her. In the end, there wasn't enough proof. Mary couldn't find solid evidence of Elizabeth's involvement in the rebellion. Executing a princess without clear proof of treason would be too dangerous, too unpopular. Elizabeth was released from the Tower and sent to Woodstock, where she was kept under house arrest. But she was alive. She had survived. The next 4 years were bloody. Mary is remembered as Bloody Mary, and she earned the nickname. Determined to return England to Catholicism, she began burning Protestant heretics. Nearly 300 people were burned alive during her 5-year reign, men, women, sometimes in groups, sometimes individually. The burnings were supposed to terrify people into conformity. Instead, they created martyrs. The flames that consumed those bodies ignited something in the English imagination that would burn for centuries. A fear and hatred of Catholic persecution that shaped English identity for generations. Mary was also desperately unhappy. She had married Philip of Spain, hoping for love, hoping for children, hoping for a Catholic heir who would continue her work. Philip tolerated her. He visited when he needed English support for his wars. He stayed away as much as possible. Mary had phantom pregnancies. Twice, her belly swelled, her breasts produced milk. All the signs of pregnancy appeared. Twice, there was no baby. The second time, she began to suspect the swelling was something else entirely. It was probably cancer. Ovarian cancer, some historians think, or uterine cancer. Something growing inside her that wasn't a child. Mary died in November 1558. She was 42 years old. She died knowing that everything she had worked for would be undone, because Elizabeth would inherit the throne, and Elizabeth was Protestant. Elizabeth received the news at Hatfield House. Messengers rode out from London with the ring that had been taken from Mary's dead finger, proof that the Queen was truly gone. Elizabeth fell to her knees. In Latin, she quoted a psalm. "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." She was 25 years old. She had survived her father's court, her brother's reign, her sister's persecution. She had survived the Tower. She had learned to keep her thoughts hidden, to say nothing that could be used against her, to trust no one completely. Now she was queen. Elizabeth's reign would last 45 years. She would defeat the Spanish Armada. She would preside over a cultural flowering that gave us Shakespeare and Marlowe and the foundations of the British Empire. She would become one of the most famous monarchs in world history, but she never forgot what she had learned as a child. She never forgot watching her father's wives disappear one after another. She never forgot being declared illegitimate, being stripped of her title, being sent to serve in her baby sister's household. She never forgot the Tower. Elizabeth never married. People have debated her reasons for centuries. Was she afraid of losing power to a husband? Was she traumatized by what she had seen marriage do to the women around her? Was there some physical reason she couldn't have children? Maybe she just understood better than anyone what happened to women who tied themselves to men. Her mother had been beheaded. Her stepmother, Catherine Howard, had been beheaded. Mary had been miserable with Philip. Jane Grey had been destroyed partly because of her husband's family's ambitions. Elizabeth chose differently. She called herself married to England. She used the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool for decades, dangling the prospect of an alliance before one European prince after another, never quite committing, always staying free. She ruled alone. What does it mean to survive the Tudor court? It means watching carefully, learning who has power and who's losing it, understanding that love is dangerous and trust is dangerous and standing out is dangerous. And sometimes the only safe thing to do is be invisible. Mary and Elizabeth were shaped by the same crucible, but they emerged differently. Mary bent under pressure and never quite forgave herself. And when she finally had power, she used it to burn the people who represented everything that had hurt her. Elizabeth learned to never bend at all, to keep her inner self hidden behind a mask of pleasantries and deflections, to survive at all costs. Both of them were brilliant. Both of them were tough. Both of them ruled England. Neither of them had children. Mary died of cancer at 42. Elizabeth died at 69, the last of the Tudors, ending the dynasty that had reshaped England. Your pillow is probably softer now, warmer. You're settling in deeper, feeling the weight of blankets that don't carry the weight of politics and survival. Those girls in their cold stone rooms, they lived and died 500 years ago. But something about their stories still resonates. The struggle to survive in systems that don't care about you. The need to hide your true self to stay safe. The way childhood shapes who we become. Mary couldn't escape the trauma of her youth. Elizabeth transformed it into armor. Both of them were trying to answer the same question. How do you survive when the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones most likely to destroy you? There's one more thing worth mentioning. Elizabeth, for all her caution, for all her masks, did sometimes reveal what lay beneath. Late in her reign, she gave what became known as the Golden Speech to Parliament. She was 68 years old. Her hair was white. Her teeth were black. She wore so much makeup that her face was essentially a mask. But she spoke, and what she said still echoes. Though God hath raised me high, yet this I count the glory of my crown, that I have reigned with your loves. She had spent a lifetime learning not to trust, not to reveal, not to give anyone power over her. And yet here, at the end, she let herself be seen. Maybe that's what survival ultimately means. Not just staying alive, but finding moments, rare, precious moments, when you can stop hiding and simply be. The fire is dying down. The candles are guttering. Somewhere in that cold palace, a queen who was once a frightened little girl is finally letting herself rest. You should probably do the same. Sleep well. You're safe here. No one is watching the door. No one is waiting with terrible news. You're just here in your warm bed, in your quiet room, and that's enough. It's more than enough. It's everything those Tudor girls would have wanted.